The wind howled through the dense Appalachian forest, its mournful cries carrying secrets older than the trees themselves. Eleanor Price clutched her wool coat tightly around her as she climbed the crumbling steps of the Galesburg Historical Society. It was the only building still standing in the nearby town of Bellwood, the last thread connecting the modern world to Galesburg, the ghost town that had vanished from maps and memory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged paper. The curator, an elderly man with thinning white hair and sharp, bird-like eyes, shuffled toward her with an eager smile. "You're the historian from Chicago, aren't you?" he asked, extending a bony hand. "Eleanor Price. I've been expecting you." "That's right," Eleanor replied, shaking his hand. "Mr. Hobbs, thank you for arranging this visit. I'm fascinated by the history of Galesburg, though I admit there's not much written about it." "That's because most people prefer to forget," Hobbs said, his expression darkening. "But for those of us who remember, well, let's just say Galesburg wasn't just abandoned. It was swallowed." The words hung in the air, thick and foreboding. Eleanor tilted her head, intrigued. "Swallowed? What do you mean?" Hobbs gestured toward a stack of worn books and yellowed newspaper clippings on a nearby table. "You'll find some answers here, though not all of them. Galesburg's history is a patchwork of greed, betrayal, and something unnatural." Eleanor's fingers grazed the spine of a leather-bound journal atop the pile. Its cover bore no title, only a faint engraving of a circle encased in jagged lines. She opened it to the first page, her pulse quickening as she read the entry. "October 15th, 1894. The mine is cursed. They won't listen. God help us all if it leaves the ground." She looked up at Hobbs, her brow furrowed. What exactly was found in the mine? The curator's lips thinned into a tight line. "No one knows for certain, but they paid the price for their greed. If you're wise, Miss Price, you'll let Galesburg's story rest." Eleanor didn't respond. She knew she wouldn't heed his warning. The journal entry sparked a fire of curiosity she couldn't extinguish. She had dedicated her life to uncovering buried truths, and Galesburg promised to be her most compelling find yet. 3 days later, Eleanor arrived at the edge of the Galesburg forest, where the road dwindled to little more than a dirt path. The air felt colder here, as if the trees themselves exhaled a chill. She parked her car, slung her leather satchel over her shoulder, and started the trek toward the ghost town. The forest grew darker as she walked, the canopy above thick and unyielding. Shadows danced between the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves set her on edge. Yet, she pressed on, her determination outweighing her unease. After nearly an hour, she emerged into a clearing, and there it was, Galesburg. The town sprawled before her like a corpse left to decay. Dilapidated wooden buildings leaned against one another, their roofs sagging and their windows shattered. Vines snaked up the walls, and the ground was littered with debris. Broken tools, rusted lanterns, and fragments of shattered lives. Eleanor stood still, absorbing the eerie quiet. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She pulled out her camera and began snapping photos, each click of the shutter echoing in the silence. The longer she stayed, the more she felt a strange sensation, a weight pressing against her chest, as if the town itself were watching her. Her exploration led her to the center of town, where a massive oak tree stood, its gnarled branches twisting toward the sky. Beneath it was a worn stone marker, its inscription barely legible. "Here lies the heart of Galesburg. May it never awaken." Eleanor crouched to examine it closer, running her fingers over the carved words. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly pulled her hand away, glancing around nervously. She hadn't noticed the figure standing in the shadows. "Don't touch that," a voice growled. Eleanor gasped and stumbled backward. A man stepped into the dim light, his face weathered and his eyes sharp. He held a shotgun casually over one shoulder, but there was nothing casual about his glare. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, regaining her composure. "Jacob," he said simply, "and you've got no business here." "I'm a historian," she explained, brushing herself off. I'm here to document the history of this place. Jacob scoffed. History? This ain't history, lady. It's a graveyard. Best thing you can do is leave it be. I don't believe in curses, Eleanor replied, her voice firm. I believe in facts, and I intend to uncover them. Jacob's expression darkened. Then you're a fool. This town doesn't just have ghosts, lady. It is a ghost. And if you're smart, you'll turn around and never come back. With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Eleanor alone with the silence and her growing sense of unease. She looked back at the stone marker, her curiosity burning brighter than her fear. Whatever had happened in Galesburg, she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Eleanor awoke to the sound of rain drumming against her tent. Morning light struggled to pierce through the dense canopy of trees surrounding her makeshift campsite. Her breath clouded in the chilly air as she sat up, shivering. Despite Jacob's ominous warning, she had stayed, compelled by the gravity of the mystery surrounding Galesburg. She brewed a quick cup of instant coffee over a portable burner, her hands trembling from the cold and the lingering tension from the day before. The night had been eerily silent, save for the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, as though the forest were alive and watching her every move. Eleanor had camped just outside the clearing, unable to bring herself to sleep within the ruins of the ghost town. Something about Galesburg demanded respect or perhaps fear. By the time she packed up her gear and approached the town, the rain had reduced to a drizzle, and a thin mist curled through the streets like phantom tendrils. The buildings appeared even more decrepit in the gray light. She paused at the edge of the clearing, pulling out her notebook and flipping through her notes. Mining town founded in 1878. Sudden disappearance in 1895. Population estimated at 300 at its peak. Her eyes lingered on the last detail, the most unsettling part of the town's history. No bodies were ever found. She pocketed her notebook and ventured into the heart of Galesburg. The stone marker under the oak tree loomed in the distance, a sinister reminder of Jacob's warning. She chose to avoid it for now, instead stepping into what appeared to be the remains of a saloon. The inside was dark and damp, with warped floorboards and cobwebs clinging to every corner. A long wooden bar stretched across one side of the room, its surface scarred and covered in dust. Empty bottles were scattered about, their glass dulled by time. Chairs lay overturned, as if the patrons had fled in a hurry. Eleanor ran her hand along the bar, her fingers disturbing decades of grime. She tried to picture the room as it once was, filled with the laughter and clinking glasses of miners celebrating their latest haul. But the silence was overwhelming, a hollow echo of the past. Her eyes fell on a framed picture hanging askew on the wall. She wiped away the grime to reveal the image, a group of miners standing proudly in front of the entrance to the Galesburg mine. The men's faces were stern, their eyes shadowed by the wide brims of their hats. In the center stood a man who exuded authority, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing eyes. Ambrose Carter, she murmured, recognizing the name from her research, the mayor of Galesburg and the owner of the mine. As she studied the photograph, something odd caught her eye. A shadowy figure stood in the background, barely visible. It wasn't one of the miners, the shape was too blurred, too indistinct. Yet, the longer she stared, the more uneasy she felt. She stepped back, her heart pounding. The floor creaked behind her. Eleanor spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim interior. The room was empty. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. It's just an old building, Eleanor. Get a grip. But the feeling of being watched lingered, making her skin prickle. She took a few more photos, then stepped outside, relieved to feel the misty air on her face. Her next stop was the church, perched at the far end of the main street. Its white paint had peeled away, leaving the wooden boards beneath exposed to the elements. The steeple leaned precariously, and the bell above was missing. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of mildew and rot. Rows of pews lined the room, many of them collapsed under the weight of time. At the front, A pulpit stood beneath a cracked stained glass window, depicting an angel holding a lantern. The angel's face was worn away, leaving an empty void where its eyes should have been. Eleanor's footsteps echoed as she approached the pulpit. A leather-bound Bible rested on its surface, its pages yellowed and brittle. She carefully opened it, revealing a handwritten note tucked inside. "They're coming. God forgive us. They're coming." The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged as though written in haste. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The note raised more questions than it answered. Who had written it? And what or who had they been so afraid of? She tucked the note into her bag and glanced around the room. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners, though the dim light made it difficult to tell if it was her imagination. A sudden chill swept through the church, rustling the pages of the Bible. Eleanor froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. The sensation was unmistakable. She wasn't alone. She turned sharply, scanning the room. "Hello?" Her voice echoed, trembling slightly. No response. Gripping her flashlight tighter, she made her way toward the door. Just as she reached it, the church bell tolled. A single, deafening chime that reverberated through her skull. Eleanor clapped her hands over her ears and spun around, her heart racing. The bell tower was empty. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she stumbled out of the church, gasping for air. The mist had thickened, cloaking the town in a ghostly shroud. The sound of the bell still rang in her ears, a haunting reminder that she was trespassing on something she didn't fully understand. She hurried back to the clearing where she had set up camp, her thoughts racing. The photograph, the note, the bell. Everything pointed to something deeply wrong with Galesburg. Yet, despite her fear, she felt a pull she couldn't resist. The town's secrets were within her grasp, and she was determined to uncover them. As she reached her tent, a faint whisper carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. "Don't let it leave." Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, but the clearing was empty. The whisper had come from nowhere and everywhere. She crawled into her tent and zipped it shut, her mind replaying the events of the day. She was no longer just a historian documenting a forgotten town. She was a trespasser in a place that didn't want to be disturbed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Galesburg was watching her. Eleanor awoke with a start, the remnants of a dream fading quickly from her mind. She had seen faces, ghostly, blurred figures whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Their eyes, hollow and accusing, burned into her memory. Shaking off the unease, she sat up and checked her watch. The morning light struggled to penetrate the mist, casting a pale, otherworldly glow over the campsite. She brewed a quick cup of coffee and reviewed her notes. Galesburg's history was a fragmented puzzle, and the pieces she had so far only deepened the mystery. She needed more answers, and she knew where to start. The mine. The trail to the mine was overgrown, the path barely visible beneath layers of moss and decaying leaves. The forest seemed to grow denser as she climbed, the air heavier with each step. It was as if the land itself resisted her approach, but Eleanor pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. At last, she reached the mouth of the mine. The entrance yawned before her, a jagged wound in the earth framed by rotting wooden beams. A rusted sign hung crookedly above, its faded letters barely legible. Galesburg Mining Company. Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the place pressing down on her. This wasn't just a mine. It was a tomb, a gateway to the events that had destroyed the town. Steeling herself, she stepped closer, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam illuminated rusted tracks that disappeared into the gloom, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She took a deep breath and entered. The mine was unnervingly quiet, the only sound the crunch of her boots on loose gravel. The walls were rough, clawed by years of excavation, and the air grew colder as she descended. Her flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced along the tunnel. About 50 yards in, she spotted something embedded in the wall. A pickaxe, its handle splintered, the blade rusted and dulled. She reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the metal, a faint whisper echoed through the tunnel. Don't. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. The sound was so soft, she wasn't sure if it was real or her imagination. She stood still, straining to hear, but the tunnel remained silent. Shaking her head, she continued deeper, her steps quickening. Eventually, she reached a larger chamber, where several tunnels branched off in different directions. The space was littered with abandoned equipment, broken lanterns, rusted tools, and fragments of wooden crates. In the center of the chamber stood a rusted cart, its contents spilled onto the ground. Eleanor crouched beside it, brushing away dirt to reveal a handful of strange, black stones. They were unlike anything she had seen before, glossy and smooth, as if polished, but unnervingly cold to the touch. A flash of movement caught her eye, and she spun around, her flashlight darting across the chamber. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, a man in a miner's helmet, standing at the edge of the light. But when she blinked, he was gone. She stumbled backward, her breathing ragged. The shadows seemed to close in, the walls of the mine pressing tighter. She needed to leave, but just as she turned to retrace her steps, her flashlight illuminated something carved into the stone wall. It was a symbol, a jagged circle surrounded by intersecting lines. The same symbol that had been embossed on the journal she found in the Historical Society. Her hand trembled as she traced the carving, her mind racing. This symbol wasn't random. It meant something, but what? As she made her way back to the surface, the whispers began again, soft and indistinct, like the murmur of voices just beyond her hearing. They seemed to follow her, growing louder with each step. "Leave us!" Eleanor broke into a run, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. She burst out of the mine, gasping for air, the oppressive weight finally lifting as sunlight kissed her skin. She stumbled a few steps before collapsing onto the ground, her chest heaving. The mine had answers, she was sure of it. But it also held something else, something malevolent. Back in town, she decided to visit another building she had avoided the day before, the town hall. It was a large structure with tall, broken windows and a sagging roof. The sign above the door had long since fallen, but the grand double doors still stood, though they groaned in protest as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Rows of wooden benches faced a raised platform where a podium stood, covered in dust. The room felt strangely preserved, as if it had been waiting for her. On the wall behind the podium was a large map of Galesburg, its edges curling and faded with age. Eleanor approached it, her eyes scanning the neatly drawn streets and labels. Her gaze landed on a marking near the mine, another symbol, identical to the one carved into the wall. "Why would this be on a map?" she muttered aloud. As she studied it, a soft sound caught her attention, a shuffle of footsteps. She spun around, expecting to see Jacob or some other intruder, but the room was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. Silence. She turned back to the map, but something had changed. There were smudges on the surface now, as if someone had run their fingers across it. Her breath hitched as she realized the smudges formed words. "Don't trust him." A chill ran down her spine. "Who?" she whispered, but the room offered no answers. That night, as she sat by her campfire, Eleanor replayed the day's events in her mind. The mine, the symbols, the warnings. They all pointed to something buried deep in Galesburg's history. But she couldn't piece it together. Not yet. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of voices. Eleanor froze, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, overlapping and indistinct. But one word stood out, clear and sharp. "Carter." She grabbed her notebook and scribbled the name. Ambrose Carter had been the mayor of Galesburg, the man who had pushed the mine's expansion despite warnings from the townsfolk. If anyone held the key to what had happened, it was him. As she stared into the fire, her determination hardened. She would find the truth no matter what. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth might cost her more than she was willing to give. Eleanor awoke with a start. The dream had been vivid, too vivid. She was standing in the center of Galesburg, surrounded by people dressed in 19th century attire. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with fear. A man in a black suit, his eyes hollow and his skin pale as death, pointed toward the mine. The earth trembled beneath her feet, and then she was falling into darkness. She sat up in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. The forest around her was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against her eardrums. The morning mist clung to the ground like a ghostly veil. Shaking off the remnants of the dream, Eleanor made herself a cup of coffee and reviewed her notes. She couldn't ignore the strange occurrences of the day before. The shadow in the photograph, the bell tolling in the empty church, and the whispered warning. Every clue pointed back to the mine, the beating heart of Galesburg's story. The diary entries had revealed fragments of the town's history, but Eleanor needed more. She decided to explore the town hall, the largest building in Galesburg, where she hoped to find records or correspondence that could shed light on the town's final days. The town hall loomed at the far end of the main street, its once grand facade now weathered and crumbling. Ivy climbed the walls, and the double doors hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. As she stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under her weight. The air was stale and thick with decay. Inside, the main hall was in ruins. Piles of rubble and broken furniture littered the floor. A massive chandelier lay shattered in the center of the room, its crystals scattered like shards of ice. Eleanor carefully made her way to a side office, where she found a desk overturned and papers strewn across the floor. She sifted through the mess, her fingers trembling with anticipation. Most of the documents were mundane ledgers, property deeds, and meeting minutes. But then she found something that made her pause. A letter dated October 12, 1894, just days before the town's mysterious disappearance. Letter from Ambrose Carter to Clara Bell. Clara, I understand your concerns, but you must see reason. The mine is the lifeblood of this town, and its wealth will elevate us all. You speak of danger, of curses, but these are mere superstitions. I implore you to put aside your fears and let us proceed without interference. You're scaring the townsfolk with your warnings, and that's a distraction we cannot afford. We've come too far to turn back now. Ambrose. Eleanor's hands tightened around the brittle paper. Clara Bell, her name had appeared in several of the diary entries. She was described as a healer, a widow who had earned the respect of the townsfolk with her wisdom and kindness. But this letter painted a different picture. A woman at odds with the town's powerful mayor. She continued her search and found another letter, this one crumpled and hastily written. The handwriting was shaky, the words almost frantic. Letter from Clara Bell to Ambrose Carter. Ambrose, I've warned you and the others, but you refuse to listen. The earth beneath the mine is not ours to take. It belongs to something far older and far more dangerous than we can comprehend. The signs are clear, the tremors, the strange sounds, the sickness spreading among the miners. If you persist, Galesburg will pay the price. You think me a fool, but mark my words. You are digging our graves. Clara. Eleanor stared at the letter, her heart racing. The warnings were clear, yet they had been ignored. The tension between Ambrose and Clara was palpable, a clash between ambition and caution. She wondered what Clara had meant by the signs. The tremors and sickness could be attributed to the dangers of mining, but the mention of strange sounds hinted at something more sinister. She slipped the letters into her bag and left the town hall, her mind racing. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces of Galesburg's story seemed to fall into place. But the mystery of what had happened to the townsfolk and what had been unearthed in the mine remained unanswered. Her next stop was the Galesburg General Store. The building was smaller and more intact than the others, its wooden sign still faintly legible. Inside, the shelves were bare, but the counters were littered with objects abandoned in haste. Tin cups, broken lanterns, and even a child's doll. Eleanor picked up the doll, its porcelain face cracked and its dress caked with dirt. She couldn't help but wonder about the child who had left it behind. In the back of the store, she found a journal tucked into a drawer. The leather cover was worn, and the pages were filled with the scrawling handwriting of Marcus Lang, the town's enigmatic drifter. She had read his name in several accounts, often associated with Clara Bell. Many described him as an outsider who had arrived in Galesburg shortly before its decline. She flipped through the journal, her breath catching as she read one entry in particular. Journal entry, October 14, 1894. Clara is right. The mine is cursed. I heard it today, voices echoing from the depths, though no one was there. The others think I'm mad, but I know what I heard. The air grows colder the deeper we dig, and the walls feel alive, as if they're watching us. Clara spoke of rituals, of sealing the mine to protect the town, but Ambrose dismissed her. He thinks only of gold. I fear his greed will destroy us all. Tomorrow I'll go to Clara. Perhaps together we can stop this before it's too late. Eleanor closed the journal, her hands trembling. Marcus had believed Clara, and they had both tried to stop Ambrose. But something had gone horribly wrong. The voices, the cold air, the sense of being watched. It all pointed to something far beyond natural explanation. She stepped outside, the sunlight barely penetrating the thick mist that still clung to the town. A sudden sound made her freeze. A faint whisper, carried on the breeze. "Help us!" Eleanor spun around, her pulse racing. The street was empty, yet she could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her gaze drifted toward the mine, its dark entrance yawning at the edge of the town like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She knew she had to go there. The answers she sought lay within. But the thought of entering the mine sent a chill down her spine. Something was waiting for her in the darkness. Something that didn't want to be disturbed. And yet, she couldn't turn back. Galesburg's story had consumed her, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to the pale light of dawn creeping through her tent. The whispers from the previous night still haunted her, but she resolved to press on. There was no turning back now, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. After a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, she ventured back into Galesburg, her camera slung over her shoulder and her satchel packed with notes, tools, and the mysterious journal she had taken from the Historical Society. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing more of the ruined town. As she wandered through the streets, she felt the weight of its history pressing down on her, as if the town itself were alive, breathing, and waiting. Eleanor's first stop was a small building with a faded sign above the door that read apothecary. Inside, rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, their contents long since decayed or scavenged. Broken glass and rusted metal instruments littered the floor, crunching under her boots. On the counter, she found a leather-bound ledger. The cover was cracked and brittle, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. Flipping through, she discovered that it belonged to Clara Bell, a healer who had lived in Galesburg during its peak. The entries listed remedies for ailments, payments in the form of goods and services, and occasional notes about the townsfolk. One entry caught her eye. November 3rd, 1894. Ambrose visited again. He's restless. The miners speak of strange sounds in the depths. I warned him, but he won't listen. The mine is hungry, and it will take what it's owed. Eleanor frowned, running her finger over the faded ink. Clara's warnings seemed to echo through time. What did she mean by "the mine is hungry"? Was it just a metaphor for the dangers of greed, or was there something more sinister at play? Continuing her exploration, Eleanor came across a house on the edge of town. Its roof partially caved in and its windows shattered. The air inside was heavy with mildew and decay, but she could see faint traces of what had once been a home: an overturned rocking chair, a broken table, and a shattered mirror. On the floor, beneath a layer of dirt and debris, she found a torn scrap of paper. She carefully dusted it off and read the faint, scrawled handwriting. They whisper in the dark. They watch. The deeper we dig, the louder they become. Marcus says to stop, but Ambrose won't hear of it. God forgive us. Eleanor recognized the name Marcus Lang from her research. He had arrived in Galesburg as a drifter, but according to local legends, he became an unlikely hero. Some accounts described him as a prospector, others as a preacher, but all agreed that Marcus was the first to warn the town about the dangers of the mine. As she pocketed the note, a chill swept through the room, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, but the house was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Eleanor made her way to the largest building in Galesburg, a sprawling mansion that had once belonged to Mayor Ambrose Carter. The house loomed over the town, its grandeur now reduced to a crumbling shell. Ivy crept up its walls, and the front door hung askew on its hinges. Inside, the remnants of opulence were still visible. A grand staircase with a shattered banister, a chandelier that lay in ruins on the floor, and faded wallpaper that hinted at the wealth Ambrose had amassed during Galesburg's heyday. In the study, she found a desk covered in dust and scattered papers. One document caught her attention, a ledger detailing the profits from the mine. The numbers were staggering, but the final entry was unusual. Scrawled in the margin were the words, "No more. We've gone too far. The earth is angry." Beside the ledger, she found a brass key, its surface tarnished with age. The key was labeled simply "Mine Entrance." Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing. The key was a tangible link to the heart of Galesburg's mystery. She pocketed it, knowing that it would lead her to the answers she sought, and possibly to the danger Jacob had warned her about. As she left the mansion, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town. The streets were eerily quiet, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air. She decided to return to the oak tree and the stone marker, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and unease. When she reached the tree, she knelt beside the marker and brushed away the moss and dirt that clung to its surface. The words were clearer now. "Here lies the heart of Galesburg. May it never awaken." She reached into her satchel and pulled out Clarabelle's ledger and the torn note from Marcus. Piecing together their words, she began to form a picture of what had happened in Galesburg. A story of ambition, warning, and tragedy. As she sat there, lost in thought, a soft voice broke the silence. "Why did you come here?" Eleanor froze. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakable. She turned, but the clearing was empty. The voice came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." Her breath quickened as shadows began to coalesce at the edges of her vision. They weren't solid figures, but indistinct shapes that flickered like smoke. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of words she couldn't understand. Gripping the brass key tightly, she stood and backed away from the tree. "I'm here to help," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to understand what happened to you." The whispers stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the clearing was silent. Then, a single voice rose above the stillness. "Don't let it leave." Before she could respond, the shadows dissolved, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. Eleanor stood there, shaken but resolute. The town spirits had spoken, and their warning was clear. She glanced toward the distant hills where the mine entrance lay hidden. The key in her hand seemed heavier now, its cold metal pressing against her palm. The answers she sought were waiting in the mine, and so, too, was the danger. Eleanor stood at the edge of the mine's entrance, her heart pounding as she stared into the gaping maw. The key from Ambrose Carter's desk felt heavy in her pocket, its cold weight a reminder of the decision she was about to make. The entrance was shrouded in overgrown vines and rubble, as though nature itself had tried to seal it off. The wooden beams supporting the tunnel were warped with age, their surfaces darkened by moisture and time. A rusted sign hung precariously above the entrance, its faded lettering barely legible. "Danger. Keep out." Eleanor adjusted the straps of her satchel, steeling herself. She had come too far to turn back now. This was the heart of Galesburg's mystery, the place where everything had gone wrong. She slipped the key into the lock of a rusted gate barring the entrance. It resisted at first, but after a few forceful turns, it clicked open. Eleanor pushed the gate aside, its hinges screeching like a warning. With a deep breath, She turned on her flashlight and stepped inside. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The walls of the tunnel were rough and uneven, their surfaces marked with the scars of pickaxes and drills. Broken tools lay scattered on the ground, alongside abandoned carts filled with rocks and debris. Eleanor paused to examine a faded map pinned to the wall. It depicted the mine's layout, a labyrinth of tunnels that snaked deep beneath the earth. One area was circled in red, labeled Deep Vein, Restricted. What were they digging for? She wondered. And why restrict access? Her flashlight beam landed on a crude carving etched into the rock near the map. It was a symbol, a circle surrounded by jagged lines, identical to the one on Clara Bell's journal. Beneath it, someone had scrawled the words, "It watches, it waits." A chill ran down her spine as she traced the lines of the carving. She had seen it before, but its meaning remained elusive. She snapped a photo and pressed on. As she descended, the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The tunnel walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of the earth above pressing down like a physical force. Her flashlight flickered, and Eleanor cursed under her breath, smacking it against her palm until the beam steadied. The darkness beyond the light felt alive, shifting and watching. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching on the gravel floor. The deeper she went, the more she felt a strange sensation, a low hum that vibrated through the walls and into her chest. It wasn't a sound so much as a feeling, like the distant echo of something ancient and powerful. After what felt like hours, Eleanor reached the section of the mine marked Restricted. A crude barricade of wooden planks blocked the tunnel, their surfaces scratched and splintered. A sign hung from the planks, the words hastily scrawled in red paint. "Do not enter. It is awake." Eleanor hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity and determination drove her forward. She ducked under the barricade, her flashlight illuminating the narrow passage ahead. The air grew colder still, and the hum intensified. The walls of the tunnel began to change, the rough stone giving way to smooth surfaces that gleamed faintly in the light. Strange markings covered the walls, symbols and patterns that seemed too precise, too deliberate to be natural. Eleanor reached out to touch the surface, and her fingers recoiled instantly. It was warm, pulsing faintly as though alive. Her heart raced as she backed away, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The tunnel opened into a massive cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center stood a jagged pillar of black stone, its surface etched with the same symbols as the walls. The hum was deafening here, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. Eleanor approached cautiously, her flashlight flickering again. She reached for her camera, snapping photos of the cavern and the pillar. As she moved closer, she noticed something on the ground, a ring of charred earth surrounding the stone. The ritual, she realized, her thoughts racing back to Clara Bell's journal. This is where she tried to seal it. The air shifted, growing heavier and colder. Eleanor froze, her flashlight beam trembling as shadows began to gather at the edges of the cavern. They swirled and coalesced, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were struggling to hold their forms. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Words she couldn't understand filled the cavern, pressing against her skull like a vice. "Leave," a voice boomed, rising above the din. It was deep and hollow, echoing through the chamber. "You do not belong here." Eleanor stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. The cavern plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the black stone. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking. "I just want to understand," she shouted, her voice cracking. "What happened here?" The shadows surged forward, their forms writhing and twisting. The voice came again, closer this time. "You have seen too much. It will take you as it took them." Eleanor's fingers closed around her flashlight, and she turned it on just in time to see the shadows retreat slightly, hissing like steam. She backed away toward the tunnel, her mind racing. Clara tried to stop it, she said, her voice trembling. She tried to seal it. The shadows paused, as though listening. For a moment, the whispers ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. She failed, the voice said finally. And so will you. Eleanor turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she retraced her steps through the tunnel. The shadows pursued her, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, threatening to swallow her whole. She burst through the barricade and didn't stop, her breath ragged and her legs burning. The hum faded as she climbed toward the surface, but the sense of dread lingered, pressing against her like a physical weight. When she finally emerged into the pale light of day, she collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The entrance to the mine loomed behind her, dark and silent, but she knew it wasn't over. The shadows were still there, waiting. As she lay there, staring up at the sky, one thought consumed her. I have to finish what Clara started. Eleanor sat in her tent that evening, her hands trembling as she flipped through Clara Bell's journal. The images of the mine, the writhing shadows, the pulsating stone, and the overwhelming hum played over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She sipped on cold coffee, barely tasting it, as she reread Clara's words. There was something methodical about the healer's entries, a sense of purpose in her warnings. Clara had known about the curse long before the town's collapse, and she had tried to stop it. Eleanor spread her findings across the ground. Clara's journal, the torn note from Marcus, and the strange symbols she had photographed in the mine. She scoured the journal for any mention of the ritual Clara had attempted. One entry, written just weeks before the town's disappearance, caught her eye. December 12, 1894. The stone hungers, and Ambrose has only fed it more. He thinks it will give him riches beyond measure, but it only takes. I have gathered the herbs, the salt, and the iron. The circle must hold or we are lost. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Herbs, salt, and iron? It sounded archaic, almost superstitious, but she knew that rituals often carried deeper symbolic meanings. Clara had been a healer, after all, a woman of both science and tradition. As she traced the words with her finger, Eleanor noticed something faintly etched in the margin. She held the page closer to her lantern's light and made out a small drawing of the circle with jagged lines surrounding it, just like the carving in the mine. Beside it was written, "Seal the heart, contain the shadow." Eleanor knew she couldn't perform the ritual without understanding it fully. She resolved to return to Jacob, the recluse who had warned her to leave. He seemed to know more about Galesburg than he let on, and she hoped he might be able to fill in the gaps. The next morning, she set off toward the edge of the forest, where she had first encountered him. The mist clung low to the ground, and the forest was unnervingly quiet, as though the very air were holding its breath. After hours of searching, she finally found Jacob near a small, ramshackle cabin tucked into the woods. He was chopping wood, his movements deliberate and methodical. He stopped when he saw her, his expression darkening. "You again," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I warned you to leave." "I can't," Eleanor replied, her voice firm. "I found the mine. I saw the stone, the shadows. I know Clara tried to stop it. I need to know how." Jacob's eyes narrowed, and he leaned on his axe. "You shouldn't have gone down there. Now it's got its hooks in you." "Please," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "I want to finish what Clara started. If I don't, more people could be in danger." Jacob sighed heavily and gestured for her to follow him into the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and herbs. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried plants, bones, and strange trinkets. A large table sat in the center, covered with yellowed papers and hand-drawn maps of Galesburg. He picked up one of the maps and spread it out before her. Clara was the only one who saw what was coming. She begged the town to stop digging, but Ambrose wouldn't listen. Greed blinded him. "What happened to Clara?" Eleanor asked. Jacob's expression hardened. She tried to seal the curse. She thought she could trap it in the mine, keep it from spreading. but Ambrose stopped her. He thought she was trying to sabotage his fortune. She died for it. Eleanor's chest tightened. Then the ritual failed? It was never completed, Jacob said grimly. But the pieces are still there. You've seen the stone. That's the heart of the curse. If you can finish the ritual, maybe, just maybe, you can contain it. He pulled a worn notebook from a shelf and handed it to her. Clara gave this to my grandmother before she died. It's all we've got left of her work. Study it, but don't take too long. The longer you stay here, the stronger it gets. Back in her tent, Eleanor pored over the notebook. Clara's handwriting was shaky in some places, strong in others, but the meaning was clear. The ritual required 3 key elements. 1. Herbs and salt, to create a boundary strong enough to hold the curse. 2. Iron objects, to anchor the circle and prevent the shadows from escaping. 3. Blood sacrifice, the life force of the person performing the ritual to power the seal. Eleanor's stomach churned at the last requirement. Clara's notes were explicit. The ritual demanded blood, not just a symbolic offering, but a true sacrifice. She must have known what it would cost her, Eleanor thought, her throat tightening. Clara had been willing to give her life to save the town. Could Eleanor do the same? Eleanor spent the next day gathering the necessary materials. She foraged for the herbs listed in Clara's notebook, sage, thyme, and rue, and carefully mixed them with salt to form a protective powder. She found rusted iron tools in the ruins of Galesburg and packed them into her satchel. As she prepared, the whispers grew louder, echoing through the trees even in the daylight. The shadows at the edges of her vision became more persistent, flickering like dark flames. Galesburg was aware of her intentions, and it wasn't going to let her succeed without a fight. That night, she sat by her lantern, staring at the journal and the map of the mine. The realization that she might not survive this weighed heavily on her. But the thought of leaving the curse unchecked, of letting it spread beyond Galesburg, was unbearable. As the lantern flickered and the whispers closed in around her, Eleanor made her decision. She would finish Clara's work, no matter the cost. The following morning, Eleanor stood at the mine's entrance, her satchel heavy with the tools of the ritual. The air was unnaturally still, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Her heart pounded as she stared into the blackness, knowing it would either be her salvation or her tomb. She tightened the straps of her bag and gripped the lantern in her hand. The whispers were louder now, echoing through her mind like an unending chant. They weren't trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to break her resolve. "I'm not afraid of you," she muttered, though her trembling hands betrayed her. With a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness. The mine was colder than before, the air thick with dampness and a faint metallic tang. The path to the cavern seemed longer, the tunnel twisting and narrowing as if the mine itself were trying to trap her. Her flashlight flickered again, but she pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. The hum began to rise as she neared the cavern, a low, vibrating thrum that resonated in her chest. The walls seemed to shimmer faintly, the strange symbols glowing like faint embers in the dark. She gripped the brass key tightly in her pocket, a talisman of sorts against the growing unease. When she finally entered the cavern, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. The black stone pillar loomed in the center, its surface pulsing faintly with a rhythmic glow. The shadows were already there, swirling and writhing around the edges of the chamber like living smoke. Eleanor forced herself to focus. She set the lantern down near the entrance and began unpacking her supplies. The herbs and salt went into a circle around the stone, each handful carefully placed as she muttered the words Clara had written in her notebook. The iron objects followed, forming anchors at 4 cardinal points around the circle. As she worked, the whispers grew louder, pressing against her mind like a storm. The shadows inched closer, testing the boundaries of her resolve. The moment she completed the circle, the cavern erupted into chaos. The shadows surged forward, slamming against the invisible barrier formed by the salt and iron. They hissed and writhed, their forms distorting as if in agony. "Stop this!" A voice boomed, deep and commanding. It came from the shadows themselves, reverberating through the chamber. "You don't understand what you're doing." Eleanor ignored it, her hands steady as she pulled out the final piece of the ritual, a small blade. The blade was old and rusted, but it had belonged to Clara Bell, a relic of the first attempt to seal the curse. She stepped into the circle, her pulse hammering in her ears. The stone pulsed brighter now, its hum growing deafening. The shadows screamed, a cacophony of anger and despair that made her knees buckle. Eleanor held the blade to her palm, her breath hitching. Clara's notes had been clear. The ritual demanded a sacrifice of blood, a binding between the living and the cursed. Her voice trembled as she recited the words from Clara's notebook, her blood dripping onto the black stone. "By my life and my will, I bind you to this place. By my blood, I seal your hunger." The moment her blood touched the stone, the cavern exploded with light. The shadows screamed louder, their forms splintering and dissipating as the circle blazed with a fiery glow. The hum reached an unbearable pitch, shaking the walls and sending rocks tumbling from above. Eleanor fell to her knees, her strength waning as the light consumed the cavern. The shadows surged one last time, desperate to escape, but the circle held. The black stone glowed brighter and brighter until, with a deafening crack, it split in two. The cavern fell silent. Eleanor collapsed to the ground, her vision swimming. The circle was gone, the herbs and iron scattered, but the stone lay shattered in the center of the chamber. The shadows had vanished, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The blade fell from her hand, clattering to the ground. Her body felt cold, and she realized with a sinking dread that the ritual had taken more than just her blood. It had taken part of her soul. She leaned against the cavern wall, her breathing shallow. The whispers were gone, but she could still feel the faint hum of the mine, as though it were a heartbeat beneath the earth. The curse was sealed, but it had left its mark on her. As she lay there, a faint light appeared at the edge of the cavern. It grew brighter, taking shape as the ghostly figure of Clara Bell stepped forward. Clara's face was calm, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "You did it," Clara said, her voice soft. "The curse is bound again. Galesburg is safe." Eleanor tried to speak, but no words came. Clara knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've paid the price. You belong to this place now, just as I did." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she realized the truth. She would never leave Galesburg. The mine had taken her, just as it had taken Clara. But it was a sacrifice she had been willing to make. Clara smiled faintly and began to fade, her spirit dissolving into the light. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finishing what I could not." Days later, a team of hikers stumbled upon Eleanor's camp, abandoned but intact. Inside her tent, they found her notes, her photographs, and Clara Bell's journal, all meticulously organized as if left for someone to find. Though they searched the ruins of Galesburg, they found no sign of Eleanor, only the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind and the feeling of being watched. The journal eventually made its way to the Historical Society, where it became part of the growing legend of Galesburg. Some say the curse is gone, sealed forever by Eleanor's sacrifice. Others claim the mine still hums at night, waiting for its next victim. And those brave enough to venture into the forest swear they've seen a figure watching from the edge of the clearing, a woman with a lantern, guarding the secrets of Galesburg. The journal sat on display in the Bellwood Historical Society, encased in glass under a single beam of light. Visitors came from far and wide to see it, a relic of mystery and tragedy, a tangible connection to the infamous ghost town of Galesburg. The neatly written entries, combined with Eleanor's photographs and notes, told a story that gripped the imagination. Some read it as a cautionary tale of greed and ambition. Others whispered of the supernatural, speculating about what truly lay beneath the earth. But no one, not even the most skeptical historians, could deny the unsettling weight of the story. Galesburg had become a legend, and Eleanor Price, the historian who vanished in pursuit of its truth, had become part of it. The hikers who discovered Eleanor's camp told their story to the local authorities. They described the eerie silence of the forest, the untouched tent, and the strange feeling that they were being watched. One of them mentioned hearing faint whispers at night, a sound that seemed to drift on the wind, calling them toward the ruins of Galesburg. They never found Eleanor's body, nor any evidence of her beyond her meticulously preserved notes. But the hikers couldn't shake the sense that she was still there, somehow tied to the town she had sought to save. Years later, the legend of Galesburg continued to grow. Paranormal investigators ventured into the woods, armed with cameras and recording equipment. Some returned with blurry photographs of shadows that seemed to move on their own. Others claimed to hear a woman's voice warning them to stay away. One group reported seeing a faint light flickering in the distance, like the beam of a lantern. When they followed it, they found themselves at the edge of the mine, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. They didn't dare go inside. The townspeople of Bellwood warned newcomers against venturing too close to Galesburg. Some things are better left buried, they would say, their voices hushed. Despite the warnings, curiosity drew people in. Amateur explorers, thrill seekers, and historians chasing their own piece of the legend. But those who entered the mine always came back changed, if they came back at all. They spoke of a low hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones, of shadows that moved in the corners of their vision, and of a woman's voice whispering, "Don't let it leave." The black stone, shattered but not destroyed, still rested deep within the mine. The curse had been contained, but it was not gone. It pulsed faintly, waiting for the day when someone foolish enough would break the seal. Eleanor Price's name became synonymous with the story of Galesburg. Her meticulous research and haunting photographs cemented her place in the annals of history, but it was her mysterious disappearance that made her a legend. Her sacrifice, though unacknowledged by most, was not in vain. Those who knew the story best, the curators, the hikers, and the few who dared to delve deeper into Galesburg's past, spoke of her with reverence. They believed she still watched over the town, a silent guardian bound to its restless spirits. And on nights when the wind was still and the forest was quiet, some claimed to see her. A lone figure with a lantern, standing at the edge of the mine, her silhouette framed by the trees. She never moved, never spoke, but her presence was enough to send chills down the spine of anyone brave enough to look. Eleanor Price was gone, but she was not forgotten. A new generation of explorers arrived at Bellwood one summer, eager to document the legend of Galesburg for a documentary. They interviewed locals, pored over historical records, and eventually made their way to the ruins. The forest greeted them with its usual eerie silence, and the mine loomed like a black void in the distance. As they set up their cameras and prepared to enter, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Don't let it leave." The crew froze, their bravado replaced by unease. One by one, they packed up their equipment and left, leaving Galesburg untouched. The town remained as it had for over a century, silent, abandoned, and waiting. The legend of Galesburg endures, its story passed down through generations as both a warning and a mystery. For those who seek its secrets, it is a reminder of the price of greed and the dangers of disturbing what lies beneath. And for those who dare to enter the mine, the whispers will always be there, waiting to greet them.